Obviously, you know everything about crypto and Bitcoin, but politics-wise, I should mention you're also a former Marine. And so what do you make of kind of that lens of, this attack and what it was, but then also what it means for kind of that way of thinking about Bitcoin being a hedge against kind of what's playing out?
I have reservations about what happened, as a Marine, as a citizen of the United States. We were led this lie about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Those things concern me because it looks like we could be dipping our toe into another foreign war that lasts for a decade. We can't afford it, and people are going to look for an alternative to that. And I think that regardless of what you think about Bitcoin, it has won the narrative of digital gold, and what other asset is better than Bitcoin as far as a hedge. And I think you're seeing that play out. So I'm someone who believes that we're going to see Bitcoin, north of 200,000 by the end of the
year. Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of Coinage. I'm your host, Zach Guzman, coming to you live from our Brooklyn studios here in New York City. A big day, a big week, and of course, a lot of news over the weekend as we are watching Bitcoin hold now above that $100,000 mark after dipping below it in the wake of the U.S. attack on Iran. Both President Trump and his Vice President J.D. Vance taking the time over the weekend to reiterate that there are options on the table for Iran. The ball is essentially in their court, was the messaging here, after that attack on the nuclear facilities in Iran. And in that, we saw Bitcoin dip as low as in the $98,000 handle. But as you saw on the chart, back up above that right now. And also want to look at some of the other cryptos in the market as well, because Ethereum, since Friday, was off by about 14%. And so farther out on the risk curve, at least in the crypto space, you are seeing a little bit of that action as, again, we're going to dig into all this. A lot of questions around what Iran's next move might be. Markets do not like the idea of uncertainty, and there is enough of that to go around here as everything is on the table now. As I was posting about over the weekend, one of the things to watch is Iran's parliament approved the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and that is a choke point that matters quite a bit when it comes to the world's energy markets, because that is where 1/5 of the world's oil supply flows through, as well as 30% of the world's liquefied natural gas supply. And so I was pointing out that if they do indeed go through with that closure, then you've got a list of other questions, a slew of other questions around whether or not the U.S. would then need to respond in kind with boots on the ground. And that is what I think a lot of people watching this all play out are obviously concerned about, aside from the fact that you have Israel ratcheting up attacks on Iran military bases as well. Certainly, things are getting a bit dicier than what we saw before earlier in this conflict. So there's a lot to cover. Excited to have John Deaton, a former U.S. Marine, by the way, I should say, along with his campaign in Massachusetts for Senate, going up against Elizabeth Warren. So we're going to get his take on everything playing out, because we are at a point. I was just on a space over the weekend with Mario Nafal, kind of talking about this idea among the Bitcoin community that this is a moment where, depending on what happens, it's not as bearish as that initial reaction might indicate, simply because as conflict continues to ratchet up, you may need an asset like a Bitcoin, especially if there are increasing world powers that do not want to touch the U.S. banking system. Of course, that was already seen somewhat in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And so there's a lot to dig into there. But as we said, this is mostly the U.S. Basically, the U.S. already played their hand in terms of what they say publicly that they want to do. And now we are awaiting what happens both on the fronts of democracy, whether or not an agreement can be reached, or how this is going to play out when it comes to the military pieces of all this. And so a lot to dig into. If I scrolled further on in kind of the idea of why, again, the Strait matters, because if you're not familiar, you might not necessarily know, even in the regions that we're dealing with here, why these things potentially do move markets. And again, it's because of that stat, which is how much energy flows through here. You're already seeing India ratchet up alternative routes and alternative purchases for oil and fuel. Energy, of course, matters when you're dealing with the amount of energy supplies that flow through the Strait. And so this hasn't been done yet. I think it's worth bringing up the poly market odds on this one, because this is something that market analysts and market watchers have been paying close attention to, because just because Parliament approved it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen. It still comes down to their supreme leader making that call. And you saw Marco Rubio basically calling on China to say, hey, please, China, use your powers here to make sure that Iran doesn't do this. Of course, interesting geopolitics here, because China has Russia as a trading partner here to potentially lean on. The U.S., of course, I should note, has stepped up. It's definitely not the old way of thinking around the Middle East in terms of the U.S. actually has pretty good oil capabilities back here in the U.S. But you're seeing the odds of the Strait of Hormuz and that closure actually playing out come down since the weekend. And so I think that that's important to highlight here, just as we play that out, because it did hit a peak, I think around like 33%, which was a peak. Actually, sorry, let me take that back. Over the weekend, we saw 52% was the peak, and so down considerably since then. Perhaps that off the table if you were to ask poly market watchers or bettors as we continue to track that. So that is essentially the reset and why I think this level right now. If you had told me, by the way, I think this is always worth going back to, because there are also detractors in the Bitcoin community or those outside of it who always say, oh, look, Bitcoin fell from 103 to 98 or north of 100 to 98 in this attack. That is not a hedge against uncertainty or inflation or anything like it. And look, we're back above it. And so those people have to be pretty quiet. And I do think over a longer time period, of course, an asset can be volatile, but still trend in a certain direction. I think it's worth stressing, and we're going to get into this with John Deaton in a second, that is those are two very different things. And so I just want to throw that out there. Also, if you're looking at fund flows, of course, this attack came after the backwards-looking data that we always get from CoinShares. But if you're looking at the fund flows heading into the weekend, last week, things were positive. I think we have that chart, Texas, to bring up here, just looking at it from CoinShares. This is the 10th consecutive week of inflows, 1.24 billion, the final tally. Year to date, north of 15 billion. Of course, as usual, Bitcoin and ETH leading the inflows. ETH did tick down a bit, though, only 124 million in terms of inflows. So the majority, the bulk, as is usually the case, Bitcoin and money flowing into those Bitcoin ETFs here, stateside, mostly what's happening. And of course, as I also mentioned, these corporate treasury buys are not to be overlooked either. We did get one from Sailor and Strategy, though it was not entirely that large. Only $26 million was the buy this time at an average price of 105,856. So underwater on that last buy. On average, his price is now sitting at about 70,000 per Bitcoin. But of course, his size is so large here. But I did think that tick down was notable, just in terms of, I'm not saying his confidence was shaken like other investors may have been last week, but certainly a smaller buy than what we've normally seen. Nonetheless, we sit here and Bitcoin is north of 101, basically holding. And of course, we'll have to see how the other pieces of all of this on the chessboard shake out. And we'll be chatting with John Deaton about that in a sec. I do want to move on to some other news that we have been watching, and that would be a rather interesting one. Because not only would I be surprised if you told me that, hey, we could be on the brink of World War III and this whole U.S.-Iran-Israel conflict could be spilling out of control, but if you also would have told me that not only would Bitcoin still be holding north of 100K, but you would also have attached to that Circle surging 8% the Monday after all of that played out, I would have been shocked. It's a little bit less shocking if you've been following the way that Circle's been trading since that IPO, up from its $31 price in the IPO. I don't know. I don't even know what we're dealing with now in terms of total overall percent changes, Texas, because it's gotten so large. My little pea brain can't handle these numbies anymore. But to go from 31 to 260 is pretty insane, considering that, not too much has happened in terms of the idea of what Circle represents as a company and how much money it makes relative to, other stablecoins out there. Essentially, as I want to highlight here, what we're dealing with is the market basically pricing Circle beyond perfection. And I think that that's important to highlight, and that's what that's the recap, I should say, from the Fundstrat note. Sean Farrell, our friends over there at Fundstrat, basically recapping the Circle price. By the way, this was pre the 8% surge, so this was back when it was trading at 240, mind you. Sean Farrell pointed out that the aggregate stablecoin market cap would need to double in 2025, or Circle would need roughly 75% market share, while the market grows 50% in each of the next 2 years to justify Circle's price. And that was back at 245. And now we're sitting here north of that by another 10%. And so if you put all that together, it is getting ridiculous as far as where Circle's trading. However, keep in mind, it's still pretty difficult to short this name. It's always in that weird kind of post-IPO window that it is kind of difficult to short new shares. And so if you consider that, again, a warning to those people looking at this name, once that starts to get easier, you would expect price movement to come down. And the alternative flip side to that, by the way, considering that Coinbase earns 50% of the interest revenue that Circle generates, a lot of people are taking another look at Coinbase, myself included, I should say, and trying to think about what that means for that stock. Only up 1.5% today. And so I think worth bringing up that chart as well, just to compare, because if you are looking to trade this one, we did chat with someone who used to work, Vishal, a friend of the show, who used to work at Circle and Coinbase, and he said he wasn't going to be caught spread trading these names, but if you didn't work for him, that's another thing to look at. And I think a lot more people are looking at the idea of short Circle, long Coin, just to kind of straddle these ones. And if you think about where Coinbase's shares are at now, kind of crazy to think that if you zoom out to its IPO, we're still basically there, still underneath where it opened in its IPO all the way back then. 342, I think, is roughly in line. Of course, doesn't capture kind of the same day volatility, but that's essentially the price of where it was, still below it. And so if you think about everything that Coinbase has added, if you think about Circle trading where it's trading now and Coinbase being entitled to 50% of those interest revenues, I think it's worth playing this right now. If I had more time, I would have played it already. But things get busy around here at Coinage, and so sometimes I don't have the time. As everyone in our community knows, as we chat about in our token-gated Telegram, sometimes things are difficult to track, and I'm sure you, the viewer, would understand that as well, because if you would have thought about this pre-US Iran attack, with ETH sitting north of 26, I think it was, just a week ago, pretty crazy to think that that's where it would be trading, given everything that's played out. I think a lot of people in hindsight, maybe myself included, would have tried to hedge a little bit more of that going into the conflict we're now seeing, just kind of seeing it all play out, certainly. Always, one of those things that we know this is what was going to happen. And we know, I guess I didn't pair these dots. Maybe I should pair these dots, Texas. Well, the reason why we care so much about the Strait of Hormuz is because if you do see that happen, you're going to get inflation, you're going to get prices going up, and you're going to get the Fed pushing out rate cuts. What does that mean? Well, that means that when we hear from Jay Powell this week on Tuesday and Wednesday, it's going to be very interesting to hear how he's thinking about those inflationary price pressures. And on Friday, we're going to get the Fed's preferred inflation reading, PCE. Those numbers kind of matter less to me now, and I'm sure that the market as well, when you're dealing with the U.S.-Iran conflict, because if we do see kind of any jitters there and oil going up, that impacts prices across the board. And what does that mean for the Fed if they are so concerned with inflation? And inflation is going to rise again. What does that mean for the Fed's rate-cutting cycle? And if it gets pushed out, crypto does not do so well in eras of stagflation, or that is, inflation not coming down and Fed cuts not happening the way that the market once thought they would. And so that is how global conflict gets sucked into the crypto sphere. I don't think it's as much fear, just root fear, that is happening in terms of sell everything, because we're keeping an eye on the stock market. And surprisingly, things over there somewhat more calm than maybe some people expected as far as where we open because markets over there are up right now. So a lot to shake out here. Clearly, still a lot of decisions to be made in that conflict, but I don't only want to focus on that and the shenanigans that is playing out with Circle not being touched by any of those fears or wobbles. And as we await John Deaton to hop into the show, I guess there is one thing to continue flagging here, which is news that pertains to the coinage community. Of course, we got our start with the exclusive interview with Do Kwon after the Terra collapse. If you haven't watched that exclusive, feel free. It's on our YouTube channel. We won an award. Where's that award? Oh, it's right behind my head. We won an award alongside the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times for our coverage in that saga. And news pertaining to that saga is that the hearing, the first hearing since the lead prosecutor in that case for the U.S. government stepped down, we're going to get that this week on Wednesday. The hearing in the Do Kwon case is coming up. Coinage will be covering per usual. And the interesting update on that front is that I was kind of interested that there was no prediction market for Do Kwon that had been opened. I thought that was interesting because there are plenty of other prediction markets out there. And the size of Do Kwon's case, obviously, as we showed, a lot of people know that case if you're in crypto. A lot of people watched our exclusive if you're into crypto. And it was interesting that there was no prediction market around that one. And so tweeted about it. Polymarket has since added theirs. Kalshi, as we saw here, added theirs as well. And so now there are Do Kwon pardon prediction markets. And I'm not going to share where I think that this would be, but if you look at Kalshi right now, since we posted about it and since they added that prediction market, odds of a Do Kwon Trump pardon have actually gone up from 7 cents to 8. And so there are some movements on that front, but nonetheless, I think more people care about that case abroad than they may here in the U.S. And so we're keeping our eyes on that one, and of course, going to be in the courtroom again to track all of that. And so just wanted to throw that out there and give the update to our community because they're always constantly asking us about what the updates on the Do Kwon case are. But that is minor when you consider the other market news as we open the show with everything that's been happening in Iran and everything that happens and plays out in the larger market, of course, much larger than that one, which is Bitcoin and the rest of crypto. I want to welcome onto the show again, though, as we've mentioned before, a pleasure to have him on the show, not just in this context, but any context in crypto. Excited to welcome back to Coinage John Deaton, former Massachusetts candidate for Senate up there. John, it's good to see you, sir. Thank you for coming back on.
Oh, it's great to be with you as always, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm trying to parse everything that I know our viewers are. I know that everyone in the Bitcoin community is trying to parse as well. I just want to get your take in terms of everything that we saw play out, where you think we are. Obviously, you know everything about crypto and Bitcoin, but politics-wise, I know less. So what do you make of kind of where we're at?
Well, listen, I think that everybody should be relieved in crypto that Bitcoin, even, I know the altcoins bled, take something like XRP, went under at $2. But Bitcoin already back over 100,000 with global macro issues like this. I think the volatility is becoming more boring, I should say, with Bitcoin. For us that have been with Bitcoin and other coins since 2017, say, we've seen such volatility in the past. If you go back 2 years ago, Bitcoin would have, lost 30, 40%. But just to dip under 100,000 for a brief period of time, get back over 102, I think it's really truly becoming less of a risk asset and more of a store of value of which its use case is now.
Yeah, well, I think that that's the interesting thing, too, because, yes, we saw a dip, but certainly, to your point, not anywhere near like the 30% swings or more that we've seen in prior cycles. I mean, it's definitely certainly graduated as an asset. But nonetheless, do you think that that shows that we've kind of graduated into a new era of, look, it might not be a day-to-day inflation hedge, but over time, that this is an asset that is necessary, especially when you have world powers conflicting on the global stage?
Yeah, I mean, listen, Bitcoin has basically most people would hope that it would have acted like gold. In issues like this, oil prices spiking, a lot of people would rush to gold, and certainly over the weekend you saw people sell out. But at I just think that Bitcoin has won its day as a store of value, and it becomes supply and demand. Sure, there's people out there that are early Bitcoiners who are still selling, that got into Bitcoin at crazy low prices, but it's basic supply and demand, and you keep seeing the Bitcoin treasury companies continuing to buy, and at some point in time, we're going to see a short squeeze, and I think that we're going to see a pop uh, of what people call the God candle or God green candle. I think it's coming. I really do. But listen, I have confirmation bias, as you know, my friend. I'm 80% in, so maybe some of this is wishful thinking.
Well, I mean, I think I don't know. I was talking to a lot of people who were making fun of Bitcoiners who were always like, "Oh yeah, see, this is a positive," and it's like, well, zoom out. I mean, it's tough to say that they're wrong. Look at how the price has appreciated over time, and so I always use the same thing as you do, John, to point to that and say, look, I think that is the story, but. I should mention you're also a former Marine, and so there is a certain military lens to look at what's been playing out, and people can also look at Bitcoin as this idea of being a hedge against U.S. spending, the hedge against what the U.S. is trying to do on the global stage. And there have been a few people pointing out that, look, we're not only dealing with the failures that Elon Musk tried to do with Doge and cutting spending from the U.S. government, but now this attack on Iran, very expensive in the way that it was played out, still questions around whether or not it's going to be worth it. I mean, you as a former Marine, John, I'm sure you're looking at this differently than I am, but what do you make of kind of that lens of, this attack and what it was, but then also what it means for kind of that way of thinking about Bitcoin being a hedge against kind of what's playing out?
Yeah, well, obviously, I have reservations about what happened. As a Marine, as a citizen of the United States, we were led this lie about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and we've heard that Iran is getting close to a nuke. I mean, if you just look at Benjamin Netanyahu from 2006 until yesterday, Iran is so close to becoming a country that has a nuclear weapon. So I'm cautious. Obviously, when we translate what's that mean to Bitcoin, all roads lead to the money printer. That's a fact. And hopefully Iran doesn't respond, or hopefully they respond in a way like they did last time, where they give notice. They shoot a couple missiles at a site that's not going to jeopardize any Marines or sailors or soldiers. Then they can say that they've responded, and then come to the table, and maybe this turns out to be great news. I'm cautiously optimistic. I'd certainly agree that Iran shouldn't have a nuclear weapon. The question is really, how close were they? And now you have the president talking about potential regime change. Those things concern me, because it looks like we could be dipping our toe into another foreign war that lasts for a decade. We can't afford it. But whether that happens or doesn't happen, if you look at the big, beautiful bill, all roads lead to more printing of fiat money, period. And people are going to look for an alternative to that. And I think that, regardless of what you think about Bitcoin, it has won the narrative of digital gold, digital property. It's a place where people can park their money, because it's had 15 years of appreciating somewhere between 40 and 50% per year. And what other asset is better than Bitcoin as far as a hedge? And I think you're seeing that play out. So I'm someone who believes that we're going to see Bitcoin, north of 200,000 by the end of the year.
What's crazy to me though too, John, is like I step back and just think about it. And again, I'm not saying we're here on the verge. I mean, certainly I hope, I pray we're not on the verge of World War III. But if you think about the idea of just kind of how big this conflict is, how long it's lasted, right? It's not something new in terms of Middle East conflict, but the idea of us entering this new chapter of Middle East conflict, U.S. attacking Iran nuclear bases, and seeing Bitcoin north of 100,000. If you would have told me that 2, 3 years ago, I would have been dumbfounded. And nonetheless, that's where we are. I wonder if it's just kind of worth reiterating that fact that look, don't look at the day to day, but that is kind of what's playing out.
Yeah, listen, you know, I bought under 100,000. I bought like $5,000 worth more of Bitcoin when it dipped to 99. Now it certainly could go if Iran does engage. Are we going to see another dip below 100,000? Sure, that's possible. But when you look at supply and demand economics, and you look at how many bitcoins are being created per day and how many are being purchased, at some point, um, the economics are going to play out. And so I'm with you. I'm hoping, the problem isn't a United States versus Iran. That's not a contest. We know that. The question is, how is China going to respond? How is Russia going to respond? There's talks of are they going to help arm Iran to fight America the way that the United States armed Ukraine to fight Russia. I mean, these are the unknowns that we just don't know. But at the end of the day, if you have a 3 month horizon, then I can't tell you what's going to happen. If you have a couple year horizon, I think that if you own Bitcoin and a few other assets in the digital asset space, a couple years from now, you'll be pleased.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, obviously, and the media is rolling all this, as I know, back at Yahoo and back at CNBC, day to day. It's a very different lens you look through. If you zoom out and kind of think about these things, bigger picture, it's a very different investment decision that people have to make. But given the fact that we're a weekly show, John, in terms of how you expect this to play out, we're seeing a lot of emphasis right now, odds falling that Iran, despite the fact that their parliament has approved closing the Strait of Hormuz, it's a very important key choke point for oil. A fifth of the globe's oil, as we highlighted off the top of the show, flow through there. About 30% of the world's liquefied natural gas. I mean, you saw Marco Rubio yesterday pleading with China to make sure that they press that doesn't get closed. And it seems like oil not really moving all that much anymore because traders don't expect that to happen. We're seeing odds fall on prediction markets as well. I mean, when you put all the political pieces together on this one, what would John Deaton, the former Marine, now politician, kind of say is the right way to handle this? Because certainly now, it seems like people want to see a negotiated agreement. Trump before wanted a negotiated agreement. How would you handle this?
Well, I don't have obviously the intel. I have questions, and people out there having questions doesn't mean you don't support a certain action. It doesn't make you unpatriotic. I believe asking questions is the patriotic thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
What intelligence did President Trump have that was different? Tulsi Gabbard in March testified that they were not weaponizing a nuclear bomb. Now, it is true that they have enriched uranium over 60%, and there is no need other than a nuclear bomb to be at 60%. But how close were they? I would like to know that because, it's interesting. Only President Trump is the only politician I've ever seen who will drop these bombs on Iran and then immediately say, okay, now it's time to talk peace, because that's essentially what he did. And but my biggest concern is this regime change issue. Because before, President Trump said that he was not favoring regime change, and all of a sudden his last tweets or posts have stated that maybe that's the course he's now seeking. That's a very precarious situation. We cannot afford a prolonged battle in the Middle East. And I'll tell you another thing: we can't afford to be engaged in a battle in the Middle East that may encourage China to move on Taiwan. What are we going to do then? And I can tell you, as a Marine, we are the greatest fighting force in the world, but we are not in a position to engage in Indo-Pacific and Middle Eastern operations simultaneously. We don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the ammunition base. So I have concerns. I'd want to know, but certainly, we. If I were President Trump, I'd have G and I'd have Putin on the phone, and I would invite the Iranian regime to come to Washington, and I know that's a controversial position
Hmm.
because we're just not in a position where we can afford a prolonged battle, and I think it would fracture uh, President Trump's support.
Well, I think also it's very interesting to think about these decisions and the democracy or the democratic moves that need to be carried out, given, by the way, that America is increasingly a bit isolated on the global stage. If you think about the trade war that just happened before all this, that's another thing where we alone might not be in that position, as you point out, but perhaps with allies would be a bit stronger, maybe. And so I don't know. I also am hoping to see things play out to let's say a better outcome than maybe perhaps people were fearing just over the weekend. But I do want to ask you more in terms of this position as you brought up between alts and Bitcoin, because I do think it has been interesting to watch that. Texas, we have the dominance chart and kind of approaching levels that are back to that top that played out in December back in 2020, and also all the way back, I believe, in 2018, John, where we're looking at Bitcoin dominance of around 70%. You mentioned Ripple retreating. A lot of the other alts getting spanked as well, even Ethereum off 14% since Friday. So, I mean, when you look at this, I know you're a big Ripple guy, but I mean, when you look at the way that alts have been trading relative to Bitcoin, what does that say to you about maybe what people should be thinking about if you're investing in crypto here?
I mean, listen, I tell people, I just disclose. Obviously, I do own XRP. I own a significant amount, but I'm still about 80% into Bitcoin. So I think Bitcoin is the golden chip. It's going to lead the market. I do believe to the Bitcoiners who are the maxis out there. I think it's time that when you look at Wall Street getting involved has determined that we're going to live in a multi-coin world moving forward. Now that doesn't mean 20,000 tokens. You know, most of them are garbage. We all know that. I don't own meme coins. I never have. I don't engage in that kind of gambling because that's exactly what it is. But when you look at, I think there's now maybe 19 proposed XRP ETFs. You have Solana ETFs. When Wall Street sees that they can make money the way they have off Bitcoin, they may not make it to the extent in these other altcoins, but I think Wall Street is determined that they are moving into others. You're actually seeing companies who are copycatting the Michael Saylor strategy and these Bitcoin treasury companies, and you see a couple companies have engaged in XRP treasury, and you've seen Ethereum treasury companies pop out. You're going to see that with Solana. You know, again, I'm not making a comparison, equal comparison, but I think there's going to be a handful of alts that are solid investments. I know that's controversial to Bitcoin maxis, but hey, that's where I stand. But at the end of the day, I'm someone who has 80% of his net worth in Bitcoin, so clearly, I favor Bitcoin as well.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to see play out because, in our conversations with the crypto task force and the head of the task force, Commissioner Hester Peirce, it does seem like there's been a serious acceleration in terms of approving other alts that also would fall into that. We're watching to see when the Solana ETF might get approved, but odds increasing there that you're going to see that approved, an XRP ETF, as you mentioned, approved, the Litecoin ETF, a lot of these altcoin ETFs potentially just wait and see, but expected to come. Bloomberg's odds right now, James Seyfert, friend of the show, raising their odds above 90% for most of those in terms of when they get approved. How do you see that playing out, though? Because I should note, as you say, in this comparison between alts, ETFs, and the like versus what we are seeing play out now in another state, including the great state of Texas, adding their own Bitcoin reserve now after Governor Abbott signed that one into law. There is a difference, perhaps, John, between, hey, you can buy an ETF share and it can go up, it can go down, versus states like Texas continuing to stack Bitcoin in a Bitcoin reserve. And so, I don't know. Do you think that some of those ETFs might be a little bit overblown, even if they do get approved? You still need people who want to put money into them, and I don't know if that's there for a lot of the other alts relative to maybe Solana, ETH, and Bitcoin.
Yeah, well, listen, I think that I would put XRP up there as well, simply because there's no stronger community than the XRP community. I know that there again, Bitcoiners will get mad at me for saying that, but listen, I've lived it. 75,000 of them joined me against the SEC. 75,000 in 143 countries around the world. That's incredible, and so I think that it depends on you. Everything's relative, right? Do I think that the XRP ETFs is going to make XRP go to $100? No, but from $2 to somewhere between $5 and $13 for in the next few years, absolutely. In my opinion, I could be wrong, but to compare it to the Bitcoin ETFs, it's not same footing as far as I'm concerned. But I think that Solana, Ethereum, XRP are going to probably survive. That doesn't mean I don't think Cardano or the others. I just think those communities have proven that they believe in the token. Is some of the ETFs overblown? Probably.
Yeah, well, I think one of those things too, in terms of Ripple specifically, and I know it's kind of, there are a few voices, and I to be fair, as I've said before, I haven't been to any Ripple events, so I haven't seen the community because I haven't been out to them. I haven't been invited out to them either, so I've never been to the Vegas conference for that. But I do think it is interesting as far as the guests that we've had on who are attached to Ripple, including Omni's founder Austin King, Harvard guy, and his company was bought by Ripple as well, so he's attached to the community. And he told us that RLUSD is what we need to basically be paying attention to. And certainly as Ripple makes the big push, we saw JP Morgan with their JPMD deposit coin built on Base. It does seem like this wall, as you mentioned, traditional Wall Street types, John, basically chomping at the bit to get involved here. And who knows what's going to happen now with the stablecoin legislation. I did want to get your take on that because if we do have the prospect of everything playing out in a divided Congress because of what's playing out on the global stage, to me, it seems rational to expect that maybe stablecoins and legislation tied to crypto suddenly not most top of mind for senators or congressmen out there. We saw it pass the Senate, but still needs to get past the House. How do you expect maybe that to shake out in Congress if you think about everything else that is now perhaps more pressing than what a lot of people in crypto want to see get done? Because, I mean, obviously, it's important, and we're going to see a lot of money flow in, but I'm less confident that it's going to happen sooner rather than later now.
Well, according to David Sachs and others that have talked about publicly, that the Genius Act is pretty much everything is just almost a formality. The way they're dictating it, the Senate was the more difficult path to take. The House is supposed to get it passed. They're talking about having it on Trump's desk. I mean, I think President Trump wants to be able to claim some kind of legislative victory, and obviously the big beautiful bill and Genius Act are the only two things that look like that they could pass. But they're saying the Genius Act's going to pass, and I think the market is actually telling us that it's going to pass. I mean, just look at the Circle IPO. It is staggering. Circle was valued between $5 and $9 billion pre-IPO in private equity. It hit 62 billion. With 62 billion. And so I think companies like Ripple, looking at that, Brad Garlinghouse has publicly stated that, Ripple doesn't need any capital. And so that's one big reason you seek an IPO, and they're not in a rush for an IPO. But when you look at Circle's success and you see that RLUSD, it is growing. I'm not comparing it to USDC right now, but they are slowly capturing market share. And you see Brad Garlinghouse saying that the stablecoin market cap is going to 5 to 10x in 5 years. You have the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, saying that stablecoins are going to be 2 trillion market cap in the next couple of years. Those are staggering numbers. And so I think that the markets are pricing in that stablecoin legislation is a done deal, and there is going to be a rush. And it is good news. But you know what that means? That means that there's going to be more attractive markets for U.S. debt and U.S. treasuries. which
Hmm.
means they're going to print more money, which means that's going to be good news for Bitcoin.
Well, I mean, in general, I've looked at it similarly in terms of, look, the Circle IPO is crazy in terms of where it went from 31 to now, as you said, $62 billion company. It blows my mind because I think a lot of people are waking up to the fact that its market cap, I think technically now, is out trading where the actual market cap of USDC is.
Right.
And, and and a lot of people are making up or connecting the dots and seeing that half of the interest revenues go to Coinbase. I personally think Coinbase is underpriced as a result of that and where Circle is right now. But that's neither here nor there. Where I do think things do get interesting, though, is that we're seeing a lot of that in terms of publicly traded companies and treasury companies and the likes of a centrally publicly traded stablecoin issuer like Circle blow up in a good way. And not so much in the actual crypto tokens themselves, the alts, as we mentioned, under pressure. And so I do wonder, I mean, John, you're kind of a voice of retail when it comes to crypto, right? In terms of everything that you led in those lawsuits. Does it seem as dead to you as it does to me? Like, I think that there's a lot of people who had invested in some of this stuff and then just like kind of went away because they got into Circle after the IPO. And, even if you bought in at 75, $80, you're still doing great. But it just doesn't seem like the crypto ecosystem has delivered as much about the community ownership pieces of Web3 kind of tenants that existed before because we're still going through public markets.
Now, listen, it's a great point. I certainly crypto has become more boring compared to several years ago. I'll be honest with you, I'm surprised, pleasantly surprised that some of these tokens, again, like if you take XRP as a sort of a retail driven token, it's held this $2 level for an incredible amount of time now, longer than it has in the past. And so I don't think it's dead. Retail's dead. And I think there'll be an excitement, but there is an argument to be made that is the 4 year cycle. Are we ever going to experience that again where Bitcoin, is going to go on a run and then the alts are going to explode after that because people are going to rotate out of Bitcoin into the alts? I think we're going to see a minor pop like that, but the days of 2017 to 19, we're living in a different world today, and so I don't know if it's going to have that kind of retail excitement.
Yeah, it is a different world indeed, and certainly, obviously, of course, the world itself is a bit of a different world after this weekend's activity. And of course, John, always appreciate your time coming on Coinage here. And like I said, the perfect guest to have on, not just for crypto, but also given your military background. I don't get to say this to a lot of guests here, but thank you for your service, sir.
Well, thank you, man. Listen, Zach, we got to get you to the XRP Vegas. I'll make sure it happens if you're willing to come.
Yeah, man. Look, I'm always open. I'm open to see this stuff myself. I know you and Eleanor have been out there for a while now. The XRP
Yeah,
community. If you're out there, hit me up.
no. I'm Brad Kimes and his wife. He's Digital Perspectives on X. He organizes it and runs it. And listen, he's gotten Brad Garlinghouse there 2 years in a row. David Schwartz, the CTO, the CEO of Uphold, and other major CEOs. And so I think it's. I think we're not going to compare it to the Bitcoin conference, right? Because everybody will like shoot us when they see it. It's funny. I got to tell you, Zach, it's funny. I was at the Bitcoin conference. I was on stage, and Scott Melker wrote, "Hey, Deaton and a couple other guys, some of my favorites." And despite taking on Elizabeth Warren, despite having 80% of my net worth in Bitcoin, someone wrote, "Who let the XRP attorney in at a Bitcoin conference?" So, but anyways, we'll get you there because I do think you'll be welcomed with open arms.
Well, I think it was interesting. I mean, it's always interesting to see the politics within crypto play out as well, because it was Brad Garlinghouse, I believe, or at least I don't know if it was technically him personally or attached to Ripple, but the skull of Satoshi was out on display in the Bitcoin conference in Las Vegas, right on the floor there, noting and talked about by Brad Garlinghouse as a I guess an olive branch, so to speak, of the Ripple community, the Bitcoin community, and we're all in this together. And so I don't know, the politics within is always interesting too. But look, I'm just the host and founder of a community-owned crypto show. More XRP, more Ripple fans want to join the Coinage community to tell us we need to cover Ripple news. By all means, anyone can always mint an NFT to co-own us, and I think that that's kind of the cool thing about what we do is we've seen a lot of communities step in and tell us to correct course or focus on certain things. And so look, happy to go out, but more importantly, John, happy that you were able to join us here on Coinage today. As I said, I always appreciate your time. Always great to get your intel and insights. Thank you again, and we'll hopefully have you back on.
Oh, yeah. Appreciate it. Have a good one.
All right. John Deaton there, former Massachusetts candidate for Senate in the United States of America and former Marine as well. Our thanks to John for joining us here on Coinage. Per usual, you can check out all the big headlines in crypto and around Web3 at coinage.media. As I mentioned, you can mint an NFT to co-own Coinage as a U.S. registered DAO cooperative out of the great state of Colorado. For myself, for our producer, Texas, for everybody here in the Coinage community, I want to thank you for tuning in again. We'll see you again soon. And by the way, if you're not coming out for Permissionless, we have events. Hit me up for details on that because we're going to be hosting live events out of the studio here in Brooklyn as well. Stop on by if you care to join us. We'll see you again soon. Adios.